The crash of shattering porcelain echoed through Ruby's roadside diner like a gunshot. Tasha Green stood frozen in the middle of the dining room, her hands trembling as she stared down at the broken plates and scattered food at her feet. Scrambled eggs, toast, bacon, all of it ruined. The elderly couple at table 6 looked up in surprise. The trucker at the counter turned his head. And her manager, Lou, a stocky man with a salt and pepper beard, came rushing out from the kitchen with a dish towel slung over his shoulder. "Tasha, you all right?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. She couldn't answer. Her throat felt tight, like someone had wrapped a fist around it and was squeezing. Her vision blurred. She blinked hard, trying to keep the tears from spilling over, but it was no use. They came anyway, hot and fast, streaking down her cheeks as she bent down and started picking up the broken pieces with shaking hands. Hey, stop," Lou said, kneeling beside her. "You're gonna cut yourself. Come on, get up." He took her gently by the elbow and guided her to her feet. Tasha wanted to protest, wanted to tell him she could clean it up, that she was fine, that she didn't need help. But the words wouldn't come. All she could do was stand there, trembling, while the other waitress, a young woman named Brianna, hurried over with a broom and dustpan. "Go on back to the break room," Lou said quietly, his hand still on Tasha's arm. "Take a minute. I'll handle this." Tasha nodded, though she didn't trust herself to speak. She walked quickly toward the back of the diner, past the kitchen where the line cook barely glanced up, and pushed through the door into the small, cluttered break room. The moment the door closed behind her, she sank into one of the plastic chairs and buried her face in her hands. How had it come to this? 6 months ago, everything had fallen apart. Her landlord had sold the building, forcing her and her daughter, Amara, out of their apartment with barely a month's notice. She'd scrambled to find another place, but every landlord wanted first and last month's rent plus a security deposit. She didn't have it. She'd been working double shifts at the diner, but it still wasn't enough. They'd ended up staying with a friend for a while, sleeping on a couch in a cramped one-bedroom apartment. It wasn't ideal, but it was temporary. Or so she'd thought. Then the friend's boyfriend had moved in, and suddenly there wasn't room for Tasha and Amara anymore. They'd spent 2 weeks in a motel, burning through what little savings she had left. When the money ran out, she'd had no choice but to call her caseworker and ask for help. That's when everything had spiraled out of control. The state had deemed her living situation unstable. A social worker had shown up at the motel, taken one look around, and made notes on a clipboard. 2 days later, Amara had been placed in temporary foster care. Tasha had been given a list of requirements: stable housing, proof of income, a safe environment. She had 90 days to meet them, or she would lose custody permanently. 90 days had come and gone. She tried. She tried so hard. But every door she knocked on seemed to close in her face. And now, here she was, with less than 24 hours left and nothing to show for it. Her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. She pulled it out with trembling fingers and saw the name on the screen: Delilah Grant, caseworker. Her stomach dropped. She answered. "Hello. Ms. Green, this is Delilah Grant. I'm calling to confirm our meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. Tasha's heart pounded. "Yes, I'll be there. And do you have the documentation I requested? Proof of stable housing, proof of marriage or committed partnership, and a letter from your employer." Tasha closed her eyes. "I'm working on it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Mrs. Grant spoke again, her voice was firm, almost cold. "Ms. Green, I need to be clear with you. If you do not provide the required documentation tomorrow, the court will terminate your parental rights. Amara will remain in foster care, and the process for adoption will begin. Do you understand?" The words hit her like a physical blow. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but sit there, staring at the faded linoleum floor, as the reality of what was happening crashed over her. "Miss Green?" "Yes," she whispered. "I understand." "Good. I'll see you tomorrow at 9. The line went dead. Tasha lowered the phone and stared at it for a long moment. Then, slowly, she set it down on the table and pressed her palms against her eyes. A sob rose up in her throat and she choked it back. She couldn't fall apart. Not here. Not now. But the dam had already broken and there was no stopping it. She cried quietly, her shoulders shaking, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. She thought of Amara, her sweet, beautiful 6-year-old daughter with the bright smile and the wild curls. She thought of the way Amara had clung to her the day they'd taken her away, the way she'd screamed and cried, begging not to go. Tasha had promised her it would be okay. She'd promised they'd be together again soon. But she'd lied. She didn't have stable housing. She didn't have a husband or a partner. She didn't have anything except a part-time job at a diner and a heart full of broken promises. What was she supposed to do? For a moment she considered running. Just packing up what little she had and disappearing. But where would she go? And even if she did, they'd find her. And then she'd lose Amara forever. No. She couldn't run. She had to face this. But how? She leaned back in the chair and stared up at the water-stained ceiling. Her lips moved, forming words she hadn't spoken in a long time. Please, she whispered. If anyone's listening, please help me. I don't know what else to do. Her voice cracked and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. She sat there in the silence of the break room, alone and utterly lost, waiting for an answer that she was sure would never come. If you were in Tasha's shoes, what would you do? Could you trust a stranger with your child's future? Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts. And if this story has touched your heart so far, please subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. You won't believe how this unfolds. Tasha wiped her face with the back of her hand and took a shaky breath. She couldn't stay in here forever. Lou would come looking for her soon, and she couldn't afford to lose this job on top of everything else. She stood up, smoothed down her apron, and tried to pull herself together. When she stepped back out into the diner, the lunch rush was just starting to pick up. A family of 4 had taken the booth near the window. A couple of construction workers sat at the counter. And in the corner booth, near the hallway that led to the break room, sat a man and a little girl. Tasha barely glanced at them as she grabbed her order pad and headed toward the family by the window. But as she passed the corner booth, something made her pause. Maybe it was the way the man was looking at her, his dark eyes soft with something that looked like concern. Or maybe it was the way the little girl, who couldn't have been more than 7, smiled up at her with a gap-toothed grin. "Can I get you anything else?" Tasha asked, her voice still a little rough from crying. The man shook his head. "No, thank you. We're good." She nodded and turned to walk away, but his voice stopped her. "Are you okay?" Tasha froze. She turned back slowly, and for a moment she just stared at him. He was handsome, she realized, with warm brown skin, close-cropped hair, and a neatly trimmed beard. He wore a simple green sweater and jeans, and there was something about the way he looked at her that made her feel like he actually cared about the answer. "I'm fine," she said quickly. "Just a long day." He didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. He just nodded and turned his attention back to his daughter, who was coloring on a paper placemat with crayons. Tasha walked away, her heart still pounding in her chest. She didn't know why, but something about that brief exchange had rattled her. Maybe it was the kindness in his eyes. Or maybe it was the fact that, for the first time in months, someone had asked if she was okay. She pushed the thought aside and focused on her tables. She had work to do. And tomorrow she had a meeting that would decide the rest of her life. She just had no idea that the man in the corner booth had heard every word of her phone call. And he was already making a plan. Damian Foster had come to Ruby's roadside diner for one reason: to get away. Away from the constant emails, the phone calls, the endless demands of running a tech company that had grown far beyond his original vision. He'd built it from the ground up, and now it ran itself more or less. But that didn't mean he ever got a moment's peace. Except here. In this quiet little diner on the edge of town, where no one knew who he was or what he did. Where he could just be a dad having lunch with his daughter. Nola sat across from him, her curly hair pulled back in 2 puffs, her tongue sticking out slightly as she concentrated on coloring a picture of a dinosaur. She was 7 years old, bright and curious, and the only thing in the world that mattered to him. They'd moved here 3 months ago, after spending 2 years in a fog of grief following his wife's death. Rachel had been everything to him. His partner, his best friend, the love of his life. Losing her had nearly broken him. But he'd had Nola to think about, and so he'd kept going. One day at a time. The move had been good for them. A fresh start. A chance to breathe. He'd chosen this town because it was small, quiet, and far away from the chaos of the city. And he'd chosen this diner because the food was decent and the coffee was strong. But today he was getting more than he'd bargained for. He'd been sitting in the booth for about 20 minutes when he heard the crash. He looked up and saw a young woman standing in the middle of the dining room, staring down at the broken dishes at her feet. Her hands were shaking. Her face was pale. And when she looked up, Damian could see the tears streaming down her cheeks. The manager had helped her to the back, and Damian had gone back to his meal. But a few minutes later, he'd heard a voice coming from the break room. The door hadn't closed all the way and the walls were thin. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but once he heard the woman's voice, trembling and desperate, he couldn't help but listen. "Yes, I'll be there," she'd said. There was a pause, and then, "I'm working on it." Another pause, longer this time. "Yes, I understand." The pain in her voice was unmistakable. Damien set down his fork and leaned back in the booth, his attention fully focused on the conversation he wasn't supposed to be hearing. And then she'd whispered, so quietly he almost didn't catch it, "Please. If anyone's listening, please help me. I don't know what else to do." Damien's chest tightened. He didn't know this woman. He didn't know her story. But he knew that tone. He'd heard it in his own voice late at night, when he'd stood in Nola's doorway and wondered how he was going to raise her alone. When he'd felt the weight of the world pressing down on him and had no idea how to carry it. He looked across the table at Nola, who was still coloring, completely oblivious. And he made a decision. When the woman came back out a few minutes later, he could see that she'd been crying. Her eyes were red and puffy, and her hands were still shaking as she grabbed her order pad. She moved through the diner like a ghost, barely there, just going through the motions. When she stopped at his table, he'd asked if she was okay. She'd said she was fine, but he could see the lie in her eyes. He didn't push though. He just let her go. But as she walked away, he knew he couldn't just sit there and do nothing. He waited until the lunch rush died down. Nola had finished her meal and was now working on a second placemat, this one featuring a princess and a castle. Damien sipped his coffee and watched the woman move from table to table, her smile forced, her movements mechanical. Finally, as she passed by his booth again, he spoke. "Excuse me," he said quietly. She stopped and turned, her expression wary. "Yes. I'm sorry to bother you," Damien said, "but I need to talk to you. It's important." She frowned. "I'm working. If you need something, I can get it for you, but otherwise." "It's about what I heard earlier," he said. Her face went pale. "What?" "In the break room," Damien continued gently. "I didn't mean to listen, but the door was open and I heard your phone call. I heard what you're going through." For a moment, she just stared at him, her mouth slightly open, her eyes wide with shock. Then, slowly, her expression shifted from surprise to anger. "You were eavesdropping?" she hissed, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "That's a private conversation." "I know," Damien said. "And I'm sorry. But I couldn't just sit here and pretend I didn't hear." "Why not?" she shot back. "Everyone else does." He didn't flinch. "Because I've been where you are. Not exactly, but close enough. And I know what it feels like to think you're out of options." She crossed her arms over her chest, her jaw tight. "You don't know anything about me." "You're right," Damien said. "I don't. But I know you're fighting to keep your daughter. I know you have less than a day to find a solution. And I know you're running out of hope." Her eyes filled with tears again and she looked away quickly, blinking hard. "So what? What do you want from me?" Damien took a breath. This was it. The moment that would either change her life or make him look like a complete fool. But he'd come this far. He couldn't back down now. "I want to help you," he said. She let out a bitter laugh. "Help me? Oh, you gonna wave a magic wand and make everything okay?" "No," Damien said. "But I can marry you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and impossible. The woman stared at him like he'd just sprouted a second head. "What?" she whispered. "I can marry you," Damien repeated, his voice calm and steady. "Tomorrow. At the courthouse. You need a husband and stable housing, right? I can give you both." She shook her head slowly, backing away from the table. "You're crazy. You're actually crazy." "Maybe," Damien said. "But I'm also serious." "Why would you do that?" she demanded, her voice rising slightly. "You don't even know me. Why would you marry a complete stranger?" Damien glanced down at Nola, who was still coloring, oblivious to the conversation happening above her. Then he looked back at the woman. "Because 2 years ago my wife died," he said quietly. "And for a while I didn't think I could keep going. But I had my daughter and I couldn't let her down. So I kept moving forward one step at a time. And along the way people helped me. People I didn't know, people who didn't owe me anything. They helped me because they could. And now I have the chance to do the same for someone else." The woman's arms dropped to her sides. She stared at him, her eyes searching his face for some sign of deception, some hidden motive. But all she saw was sincerity. "This is insane," she said, but her voice was softer now, less certain. "I know," Damien said. "But you're out of options. And I'm offering you a way out. No strings attached. You and your daughter can live in my house. You'll have your own space. You can work or not work, whatever you need. And when you're back on your feet, if you want to end the marriage, we can do that. But right now, in this moment, I can help you keep your daughter. And I think that's all that matters." She was silent for a long moment, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Then finally she spoke. What's your name? Damien, he said. Damien Foster. I'm Tasha, she said quietly. Tasha Green. Nice to meet you, Tasha. She let out a shaky laugh and wiped her eyes. This is the craziest thing I've ever heard. Probably, Damien agreed. But is it any crazier than losing your daughter? That stopped her. She looked down at Nola, who had finally looked up from her coloring and was now watching them with curious brown eyes. Daddy, who's that? Nola asked. This is Tasha, Damien said. She works here. Nola smiled. Hi, Tasha. Tasha managed a small smile in return. Hi, sweetheart. Damien looked back at Tasha. Think about it. I'll be here until closing. If you want to talk more, I'll be waiting. She nodded slowly, still looking dazed. Then she turned and walked away, disappearing into the kitchen. Damien sat back in the booth and exhaled slowly. He didn't know if she'd take him up on his offer. But he'd done what he could. The rest was up to her. Beside him, Nola tugged on his sleeve. Daddy, is she okay? Damien looked down at his daughter and smiled gently. I hope so, kiddo. I really hope so. Tasha spent the rest of her shift in a daze. She moved through the motions, taking orders, delivering food, refilling coffee cups, but her mind was 1,000 miles away. Or maybe just a few feet away in the corner booth where Damien Foster sat with his daughter, calmly sipping his coffee like he hadn't just offered to turn her entire world upside down. Marry him? A stranger? It was absurd. It was reckless. It was impossible. And yet, it was also the only option she had left. She tried to push the thought away, tried to focus on her work, but it kept creeping back in. What if he was serious? What if this was real? What if, by some miracle, she could actually keep Amara? By the time her shift ended at 8 o'clock, her head was pounding and her stomach was in knots. She hung up her apron, grabbed her purse, and stepped out into the parking lot. The sun had set and the air was cool and crisp. She took a deep breath and leaned against the brick wall of the diner, trying to collect herself. Tasha. She looked up and saw Damien walking toward her. Nola was beside him, holding his hand and yawning sleepily. I didn't think you'd wait, Tasha said. I told you I would, Damien replied. He stopped a few feet away, giving her space. Have you thought about it? Tasha let out a long breath. I haven't thought about anything else. And? She looked down at Nola, who was leaning against her father's leg, her eyes half closed. You have a daughter, Tasha said quietly. You're really willing to bring a stranger into her life like this? Damien glanced down at Nola, his expression soft. Nola's been through a lot. She lost her mom. She had to leave the only home she'd ever known. But she's resilient. And I think having another kid around might actually be good for her. She's been lonely. Tasha felt a lump rise in her throat. What if your family finds out? What if people ask questions? Let them ask, Damien said simply. I don't care what people think. I care about doing what's right. And right now, helping you keep your daughter is the right thing to do. Tasha stared at him, trying to find the catch, the angle, the hidden motive. But there was nothing. Just a quiet, steady kindness that she hadn't seen in a long time. I don't understand why you're doing this, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Because I can, Damien said. And because someone should. Tears welled up in her eyes again and she blinked them back. If I say yes, what happens next? We meet tonight to go over the details, Damien said. There's a coffee shop a few blocks from here that's open late. We can sit down, talk through everything and make sure we're on the same page. Then tomorrow morning we go to the courthouse, get married, and bring the paperwork to your caseworker. Tasha's heart was racing. This was happening. This was actually happening. And after that? After that, you and your daughter move into my house, Damien said. I have plenty of space. You'll have your own room, your own privacy. And we'll figure out the rest as we go. What about your work? Your life? I work from home most of the time, Damien explained. I run a tech company, but I have a good team. I don't need to be in an office every day. And as for my life, it's pretty quiet. Just me and Nola. Adding you and your daughter won't change that much. Tasha shook her head in disbelief. You make it sound so simple. It is simple, Damien said. We're just two parents trying to take care of our kids. That's all. Tasha looked at him for a long moment and then, slowly, she nodded. Okay. Damien's face softened with relief. Okay. Okay, Tasha repeated, more firmly this time. I'll do it. I'll marry you. Damien smiled, and it was the first real smile she'd seen from him. All right then. Let's go get some coffee and figure this out. An hour later, Tasha sat across from Damien in a small coffee shop called The Grind. Nola had fallen asleep in the booth beside her father, her head resting on his shoulder. Tasha had a cup of tea in front of her, but she hadn't touched it. Her hands were folded on the table, her fingers twisting together nervously. Damien had a legal pad in front of him, and he was writing notes in neat, precise handwriting. "Okay," he said, looking up at her. "Let's start with the basics. Your caseworker's name is Delilah Grant, right?" "Yes," Tasha said. "And the meeting is tomorrow at 9 a.m.? "Yes." "And you need proof of marriage, proof of stable housing, and a letter from your employer?" Tasha nodded. "The letter I can get from Lou, my manager. But the housing and the marriage, that's what I didn't have." "You'll have both by tomorrow," Damien said. He tapped his pen against the pad. "I've already contacted my attorney. He's expediting the marriage license application tonight. We can pick it up first thing in the morning and go straight to the courthouse. The ceremony itself will take less than 10 minutes. Tasha's head was spinning. "You have an attorney on standby?" "I have an attorney on retainer," Damien corrected gently. "He's used to me calling at odd hours." "Must be nice," Tasha muttered. Damien looked up, his expression serious. "Tasha, I know this is a lot. And I know you're probably scared. But I need you to trust me. I'm not doing this to hurt you or to take advantage of you. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. And because I believe you deserve a chance to keep your daughter." Tasha's eyes filled with tears for what felt like the 100th time that day. "I just don't understand why you care. You don't owe me anything." "No," Damien agreed. "But that doesn't mean I shouldn't help." She wiped her eyes and took a shaky breath. "Okay, so we get married tomorrow. And then what?" "Then we go to your caseworker with the paperwork," Damien said. "You'll have proof of marriage and proof of stable housing. I'll write a letter as well, stating that you and your daughter are living with me and that I'm supporting you both. That should be enough to satisfy the court's requirements." "And if it's not?" "Then we fight," Damien said simply. "But I don't think it'll come to that. You've been working hard to get your daughter back. You've been showing up, doing everything they've asked. This is just the last piece of the puzzle." Tasha nodded slowly. "And after I get Amara back? What then?" "Then you focus on being her mom," Damien said. "You don't have to worry about rent or bills or any of that. Just focus on your daughter and getting back on your feet. When you're ready, if you want to go back to work, you can. If you want to go to school, you can do that too. Whatever you need, I'll support it." "And what do you get out of this?" Tasha asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. Damien looked at her steadily. "I get to help someone who needs it. That's enough for me." Tasha didn't know what to say to that. She'd spent so long fighting alone, struggling to keep her head above water, that the idea of someone stepping in to help with no ulterior motive seemed almost too good to be true. But as she looked at Damien, at the sincerity in his eyes and the gentle way he held his sleeping daughter, she found herself believing him. Maybe, just maybe, this was real. "Okay," she said quietly. "Let's do this." Damien smiled. "We'll get through this together." They spent the next hour going over the details. Damien explained that his house was about 15 minutes outside of town, a large, modern home with 4 bedrooms and plenty of space. Tasha and Amara would have the entire upstairs guest suite, complete with a bedroom, bathroom, and a small sitting area. Damien and Nola's rooms were on the main floor, so there would be privacy for everyone. "What about Nola?" Tasha asked. "How are you going to explain this to her?" "I'll tell her the truth," Damien said. "In a way she can understand. I'll explain that you and your daughter need a place to stay, and that we're going to help. Kids are more accepting than adults. She'll be fine." Tasha hoped he was right. By the time they left the coffee shop, it was almost midnight. Damien walked Tasha to her car, a beat-up sedan that had seen better days. She unlocked the door and turned to face him. "Thank you," she said softly. "I don't know how to say it any other way. Just, thank you." Damien shook his head. "You don't have to thank me. Just show up tomorrow and we'll make this happen." Tasha nodded, and then, on impulse, she reached out and squeezed his hand. He squeezed back, and for a moment they just stood there, 2 strangers bound together by an impossible promise. "I'll see you tomorrow," Tasha said. "See you tomorrow," Damien replied. She got into her car and drove away, her heart pounding in her chest. As she pulled onto the highway, she glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Damien standing in the parking lot, watching her go. Tomorrow everything would change. Tomorrow she would marry a man she barely knew. Tomorrow she would get her daughter back. Tomorrow her life would begin again. The morning sun was just beginning to rise when Tasha pulled into the parking lot of the county courthouse. She sat in her car for a moment, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. This was it. This was really happening. She glanced down at the blue dress she was wearing. It wasn't new. She'd borrowed it from Brianna, the other waitress at the diner, who'd been surprised but supportive when Tasha had nervously explained what was happening. The dress was simple, knee-length, with short sleeves and a modest neckline. It wasn't a wedding dress, not even close, but it was the best she could do on short notice. She checked her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her hair was pulled back in a low bun, and she'd put on a little makeup to hide the dark circles under her eyes. She didn't look like a bride. She looked like a woman who was barely holding it together. But that was fine. This wasn't about romance or fairy tales. This was about survival. A knock on the window startled her. She looked up and saw Damien standing outside, smiling gently. He was wearing a gray suit with a white shirt and a blue tie that matched her dress, though she was sure that was just a coincidence. Nola stood beside him, holding his hand. She was wearing a yellow sundress with tiny white flowers on it, and her hair was styled in two neat braids. Tasha opened the door and stepped out. "Hi," she said, her voice shaky. "Hi," Damien replied. "You look nice." "Thanks," Tasha said, smoothing down the front of her dress. "You too." Nola tugged on her father's hand. "Daddy, is this the wedding?" Damien knelt down so he was at her eye level. "Yes, sweetheart. Remember what we talked about last night? Tasha and I are going to get married so that she and her daughter can come live with us." Nola nodded solemnly. "So they won't be alone anymore." "That's right," Damien said, smiling. Nola looked up at Tasha. "Are you scared?" Tasha's breath caught in her throat. She knelt down as well, meeting the little girl's curious gaze. "Yeah," she admitted. "I am a little scared." "That's okay," Nola said seriously. "Daddy says it's okay to be scared sometimes. It just means you're brave." Tasha felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She blinked them back and smiled. "Your daddy's a smart man." Nola grinned. "I know." Damien stood and offered Tasha his hand. "Ready?" Tasha took a deep breath, then placed her hand in his. His grip was warm and steady, and for the first time in days she felt like maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay. "Ready?" she said. They walked into the courthouse together, Nola skipping along beside them. The building was old and stately, with high ceilings and marble floors. It smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old paper. They made their way to the clerk's office, where a middle-aged woman with reading glasses perched on her nose greeted them with a practiced smile. "Good morning," she said. "How can I help you?" "We're here to get married," Damien said. The woman glanced between them, then down at Nola. "Do you have your marriage license?" Damien pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket and handed it over. The woman examined it, made a few notes on her computer, and then nodded. "Everything looks in order. The ceremony will take place in room 3 down the hall. Judge Harrison will be with you shortly." "Thank you," Damien said. They followed the signs to room 3, a small, plainly decorated space with a desk, a few chairs, and an American flag in the corner. Tasha sat down in one of the chairs, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Damien sat beside her, and Nola climbed onto his lap, resting her head against his chest. "How are you holding up?" Damien asked quietly. "I don't know," Tasha admitted. "This is all so surreal." "I know," Damien said. "But you're doing great." Before Tasha could respond, the door opened and a tall, gray-haired man in a black robe stepped inside. "Good morning," he said warmly. "I'm Judge Harrison. Are we ready to begin?" Tasha and Damien both stood. "Yes, sir," Damien said. The judge took his place behind the desk and opened a small folder. "This is a civil ceremony, so it'll be brief and to the point. Do you have your rings?" Tasha froze. Rings. She hadn't even thought about rings. But Damien reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 simple gold bands. He handed one to Tasha, and her eyes widened in surprise. "I picked them up this morning," he said quietly. "Just in case." Tasha stared down at the ring in her hand. It was plain, unadorned, but beautiful in its simplicity. She looked up at Damien, her throat tight. "You thought of everything." "I tried," he said with a small smile. Judge Harrison cleared his throat. "All right then. Let's begin. Damien Foster, do you take Tasha Green to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live?" Damien looked at Tasha, his dark eyes steady and kind. "I do." "And Tasha Green," the judge continued, "do you take Damien Foster to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live?" Tasha's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. This was it. The moment that would change everything. She looked at Damien, at the man who had stepped into her life like an answer to a prayer she hadn't even finished praying. And she knew in that moment that she was making the right choice. "I do," she said, her voice clear and steady. "May I have the rings?" the judge asked. Damien handed his ring to Tasha, and Tasha handed hers to Damien. Their hands were shaking as they slid the rings onto each other's fingers. "By the power vested in me by the state," Judge Harrison said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Tasha's eyes widened. She hadn't thought about this part either. She glanced at Damien, who gave her a reassuring nod. Then gently he leaned in and pressed a soft, brief kiss to her cheek. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't passionate. But it was kind. And in that moment it was enough. "Congratulations," Judge Harrison said, smiling. "You're now legally married." Tasha let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. It was done. They were married. Nola clapped her hands together. "Yeah. Now we're a family." Damien laughed and scooped her up into his arms. "That's right, kiddo." Tasha stood there, her hand pressed to her cheek where Damien had kissed her, feeling like she was in a dream. But it wasn't a dream. It was real. And in just a few hours she was going to see her daughter again. They signed the paperwork, received their marriage certificate, and walked out of the courthouse together. As they stepped into the bright morning sunlight, Tasha felt something she hadn't felt in months: hope. "Thank you," she said to Damien as they walked toward the parking lot. "You already thanked me," Damien said. "I know," Tasha said. "But I needed to say it again." He smiled. "You're welcome. Now let's go get your daughter." They drove to the Office of Child Protective Services, where Mrs. Delilah Grant was waiting for them. The caseworker was a stern-looking woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She sat behind her desk, her hands folded on top of a thick manila folder. "Miss Green," she said as Tasha and Damien entered the office. "And you must be Mr. Foster." "Yes, ma'am," Damien said, shaking her hand. Mrs. Grant gestured for them to sit. "I understand you got married this morning." "Yes," Tasha said, her voice tight with nerves. She handed over the marriage certificate. "Here's the proof." Mrs. Grant examined the document carefully, then set it down on her desk. "And you're living together?" "Yes," Damien said. "Tasha and her daughter will be living in my home. I have a letter here detailing the living arrangements and confirming that I'm providing financial support." He handed over a typed letter on official letterhead. Mrs. Grant read it, her expression unreadable. Then she looked up at Tasha. "This is all very sudden," she said. "I know," Tasha said. "But it's real. Damien and I are married. We have a stable home. And I just want my daughter back." Mrs. Grant studied her for a long moment. Then finally she nodded. "All right. Everything appears to be in order. I'll approve the release. You can pick up Amara this afternoon." Tasha's eyes filled with tears. "Really? Really?" Mrs. Grant said. "But understand, Ms. Green, that this is not the end of the process. There will be follow-up visits. I will be monitoring the situation to ensure that Amara is in a safe and stable environment. Do you understand?" "Yes," Tasha said quickly. "I understand. I'll do whatever it takes." Mrs. Grant's expression softened slightly. "I believe you will. Go get your daughter." Tasha stood on shaky legs and Damien stood beside her. They walked out of the office together, and the moment they were outside, Tasha broke down. She covered her face with her hands and sobbed, her whole body shaking with relief and exhaustion and overwhelming gratitude. Damien put a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It's okay," he said softly. "You did it." "We did it," Tasha corrected, looking up at him through her tears. "I couldn't have done this without you." He smiled. "That's what family is for." And for the first time Tasha believed him. The house was nothing like Tasha had imagined. When Damien had said he had a place outside of town, she'd pictured something modest, maybe a small ranch-style home or a modest two-story house. But as they pulled up the long driveway, her breath caught in her throat. The house was massive. It was a modern two-story building with large windows, clean lines, and a wraparound porch. The yard was beautifully landscaped, with neatly trimmed hedges, colorful flower beds, and a sprawling lawn that seemed to go on forever. There was even a swing set in the backyard, and Tasha could see a small garden off to the side. "This is your house?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Damien glanced over at her and smiled. "Yeah, I know it's a lot, but it's home." Tasha didn't know what to say. She'd spent the last 6 months scrambling to find a one-bedroom apartment she could barely afford, and now she was about to move into a house that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Behind them, in the back seat, Amara was staring out the window with wide eyes. She was small for her age, with dark curls that framed her face and bright, curious eyes that took in everything around her. She'd been quiet since they picked her up from the foster home, clinging tightly to Tasha's hand and barely speaking. But now, looking at the house, a small smile crept onto her face. "Mama, is this where we're gonna live?" she asked softly. Tasha turned in her seat and smiled at her daughter. "Yes, baby. This is our new home. Forever?" Amara asked, her voice hopeful. Tasha's heart clenched. "For as long as we need it." Damien parked the car in the driveway and they all climbed out. Nola had been bouncing with excitement the entire drive, and now she grabbed Amara's hand the moment her feet hit the ground. "Come on. I'll show you my room," Nola said, tugging Amara toward the front door. Amara looked back at Tasha, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. Tasha nodded encouragingly. "Go ahead, baby. It's okay." The two girls ran toward the house and Damien unlocked the door, ushering them inside. Tasha followed slowly, her heart pounding. The inside of the house was just as impressive as the outside. The entryway opened into a spacious living room with high ceilings, hardwood floors, and large windows that let in streams of natural light. The furniture was simple but elegant, and everything was impeccably clean. "This way," Damien said, leading her up a staircase to the second floor. "Your rooms are up here." He opened a door at the end of the hallway and Tasha stepped inside. The suite was beautiful. There was a large bedroom with a queen-sized bed, a dresser, and a small sitting area with a couch and a bookshelf. Through another door she could see a private bathroom with a walk-in shower and a deep soaking tub. And next to the bedroom was a smaller room, perfect for Amara, with a twin bed, a desk, and a window that overlooked the backyard. "This is amazing," Tasha breathed. "I'm glad you like it," Damien said. "There are fresh linens in the closet, and the bathroom is fully stocked with towels and toiletries. If you need anything else, just let me know." Tasha turned to face him, tears welling up in her eyes. "Damien, I don't know how to thank you for this." "You don't have to," he said gently. "Just make yourself at home." Over the next few days, Tasha and Amara settled into their new life. It was an adjustment to say the least. Tasha was used to living in cramped spaces, counting every penny, and constantly worrying about where they'd be sleeping the next night. But here in Damien's home, those worries seemed to melt away. Amara, who had been so quiet and withdrawn when they first picked her up, began to come out of her shell. She and Nola became fast friends, spending hours playing together in the backyard, building forts out of blankets and drawing pictures with crayons. Tasha would watch them from the kitchen window, her heart swelling with gratitude and relief. Damien was kind, patient, and respectful. He gave Tasha space when she needed it but was always nearby if she needed help. He worked from home most days, spending hours in his home office on video calls and typing away on his laptop. But he always made time for the girls, playing with them in the evenings and reading bedtime stories when they asked. One morning, Tasha woke up early and made her way downstairs. She found Damien in the kitchen, already dressed for the day in a maroon button-down shirt and jeans. He was making pancakes and the smell of butter and maple syrup filled the air. "Good morning," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "I hope I didn't wake you." "You didn't," Tasha said, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "I'm just not used to sleeping past 6 anymore." Damien chuckled. "Old habits die hard, huh?" "Something like that," Tasha said, taking a sip of her coffee. She watched him flip a pancake with practiced ease. "You cook." "I had to learn after Rachel died," Damien said. "It was either that or live on takeout, and I didn't want Nola growing up on pizza and burgers every night." Tasha smiled. "Well, you're doing a great job." "Thanks," Damien said. He plated a stack of pancakes and set them on the table. "Help yourself." Tasha sat down and took a bite. The pancakes were fluffy and delicious and she couldn't help but sigh in contentment. "These are really good." "I'm glad," Damien said, sitting down across from her. "So, how are you adjusting?" Tasha considered the question. "It's been overwhelming, honestly, but in a good way. Amara's doing so much better. She's laughing again, playing again. I'd forgotten what that looked like." "I'm glad to hear it," Damien said. "And how are you doing?" Tasha paused, her fork halfway to her mouth. No one had asked her that in a long time. "I'm okay," she said slowly. I'm still processing everything. It's hard to believe this is real, you know? Like any moment I'm going to wake up and find out it was all a dream." "It's not a dream," Damien said gently. You're safe. Amara's safe. And you're both going to be just fine. Tasha looked at him, her eyes searching his face. Why are you doing this, Damien? Really? No one is this kind without wanting something in return. Damien set down his fork and leaned back in his chair. I told you before. I've been where you are. Not exactly, but close enough. And when I was at my lowest, people helped me. Strangers even. They didn't ask for anything in return. They just helped because they could. And I promised myself that if I ever had the chance to do the same, I would. Tasha's throat tightened. But this is so much more than just helping. You married me. You let me and my daughter move into your home. You're feeding us, supporting us. That's huge. Maybe, Damien said. But it's also the right thing to do. Tasha shook her head in disbelief. I don't think I'll ever understand you. Damien smiled. That's okay. You don't have to. That afternoon, Tasha called Lou at the diner and told him she'd be taking a few weeks off to get settled. He was understanding, though she could hear the concern in his voice. She promised she'd be back soon, even though she wasn't sure if she meant it. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, Tasha found herself sitting on the porch, watching the girls play in the yard. Nola was pushing Amara on the swing and their laughter filled the air. Damien stepped outside and sat down beside her. Mind if I join you? Not at all, Tasha said. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the girls play. Finally, Tasha spoke. I've been thinking, she said. About what you said earlier. About people helping you when you needed it. Yeah, Damien said. Who were they? Tasha asked. The people who helped you? Damien was quiet for a moment, then he said, neighbors mostly. After Rachel died, I was a mess. I couldn't cook, couldn't clean, could barely function. And people just showed up. They brought meals. They watched Nola when I had to work. They sat with me when I needed someone to talk to. They didn't ask for anything. They just helped. Tasha felt tears prick at her eyes. That's beautiful. It was, Damien agreed. And it taught me something important. That kindness doesn't have to make sense. It doesn't have to be logical or reasonable. It just has to be. Tasha looked over at him, and for the first time she allowed herself to really see him. Not as a stranger or a savior or some larger-than-life figure. But as a person. A kind, generous, hurting person who had chosen to turn his pain into something good. Thank you, she said softly. You're welcome, Damien replied. And as they sat there together, watching the girls play in the fading light, Tasha felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt like she was home. The weeks that followed were filled with a kind of quiet peace that Tasha had never experienced before. For the first time in years, she wasn't waking up in a panic, wondering where she'd find the money for rent or how she'd put food on the table. Instead, she woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside her window and the smell of coffee brewing downstairs. Damien had insisted that she didn't need to rush back to work. He told her to take her time to focus on Amara and to figure out what she wanted to do next. It was a foreign concept to Tasha, who had been working since she was 16 years old. But slowly she allowed herself to accept his generosity. In the mornings, she'd make breakfast for the girls while Damien worked in his office. Then she'd spend the day with Amara, taking her to the park, reading with her, or just sitting together and talking. Amara was slowly returning to the bright, energetic child she'd been before everything fell apart. She smiled more. She laughed more. And every night, she fell asleep with a contented sigh that made Tasha's heart ache with relief. One afternoon, Tasha was in the kitchen preparing sandwiches for lunch when Damien emerged from his office, rubbing the back of his neck. He looked tired, and Tasha couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. Everything okay? She asked. Yeah, just a long morning, Damien said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Had a call with some investors. They want to expand the company, but I'm not sure it's the right move. Tasha hesitated. She didn't know much about business, but she could hear the tension in his voice. Do you want to talk about it? Damien looked surprised. You don't have to. I know, Tasha said. But I want to. You've done so much for me. The least I can do is listen. Damien smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached his eyes. All right. Let me grab my sandwich and I'll tell you all about it. They sat at the kitchen table and Damien explained the situation. His company had developed a software platform that was being used by businesses all over the country. The investors wanted him to scale up, to hire more people, to open new offices. But Damien was hesitant. He'd built the company because he loved the work, not because he wanted to run a corporate empire. Tasha listened carefully, asking questions when she didn't understand something. And when he finished, she said, "It sounds like you're afraid of losing control." Damien blinked. Yeah, I guess I am. So don't, Tasha said simply. If you expand, do it on your terms. Hire people you trust. Keep the parts of the business that you love. And let go of the parts that don't matter to you. Damien stared at her for a moment, then he laughed. You make it sound so simple. Maybe it is, Tasha said with a shrug. Or maybe I have no idea what I'm talking about. No, Damien said, his expression thoughtful. I think you're right. From that day on they began to talk more. Not just about the day-to-day logistics of running the household, but about their lives, their dreams, and their fears. Damien told her about his late wife, Rachel, and how much he missed her. He told her about the guilt he carried, wondering if he'd done enough, if he'd been a good husband, if he was being a good father. Tasha, in turn, opened up about her own past. She told him about Amara's father, who had left the moment he found out she was pregnant. She told him about the shame she'd felt, being a single mother with no support system and no safety net. She told him about the fear that had consumed her when she'd lost custody of Amara, the fear that she'd failed as a mother, that she wasn't good enough. Damien listened without judgment, without pity, just with a quiet understanding that made Tasha feel seen in a way she'd never felt before. You're a good mother, he said one evening as they sat together on the porch. The girls were inside watching a movie, and the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and pink. How do you know? Tasha asked. Because Amara is happy, Damien said. Because she feels safe. Because she knows she's loved. That's all that matters. Tasha felt tears well up in her eyes, but this time they were tears of gratitude, not sadness. Thank you, she whispered. Damien reached over and took her hand. His touch was warm and steady, and Tasha didn't pull away. Instead, she squeezed his hand back and they sat there together in comfortable silence, watching the sky fade from orange to purple to black. A few weeks later, Mrs. Delilah Grant made her first home visit. Tasha had been dreading it, terrified that the caseworker would find some reason to take Amara away again. But Damien had been calm and reassuring, telling her that everything would be fine. When Mrs. Grant arrived, she was all business. She inspected the house, asked questions about the living arrangements, and observed the way Tasha and Damien interacted with the girls. Nola and Amara played together happily, showing Mrs. Grant their drawings and chattering about their favorite cartoons. They seem very close, Mrs. Grant observed. They are, Tasha said. They've become like sisters. Mrs. Grant made a note on her clipboard, then turned her attention to Damien. And you, Mr. Foster. How are you finding this arrangement? It's been great, Damien said honestly. Tasha and Amara are part of the family now. We all look out for each other. Mrs. Grant studied him for a moment, as if trying to determine whether he was being truthful. Then she nodded. I see. She spent another hour at the house, asking more questions and making more notes. When she finally stood to leave, Tasha walked her to the door, her heart pounding. Miss Green, Mrs. Grant said, her voice softer than it had been before. I have to say I'm impressed. This is a stable, loving environment. Amara is clearly thriving. And you seem to be doing much better yourself. Tasha's breath caught in her throat. Does that mean? It means you're doing everything right, Mrs. Grant said. Keep it up and I don't foresee any issues moving forward. Tasha felt like she could collapse with relief. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you so much. Mrs. Grant gave her a small smile, then left. Tasha closed the door behind her and leaned against it, tears streaming down her face. Damien appeared in the hallway, concern written all over his face. What did she say? She said we're doing great, Tasha said, laughing through her tears. She said Amara is thriving. Damien's face broke into a wide smile, and he pulled Tasha into a hug. She stiffened at first, surprised, but then she relaxed and let herself lean into him. He smelled like coffee and clean laundry, and his arms felt safe and solid around her. We did it, he said softly. Yeah, Tasha whispered. We did. And for the first time in a long time, Tasha allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. It was a Saturday afternoon, and the house was alive with laughter and noise. Nola and Amara were in the backyard, running through the sprinklers and shrieking with delight. Tasha stood at the kitchen window, watching them with a smile on her face. She'd never seen Amara this happy, this carefree, and it filled her heart to bursting. Behind her, Damien was loading the dishwasher. He'd insisted on cleaning up after lunch, despite Tasha's protests. You cooked, he'd said. I clean. That's the deal. Tasha had given in, mostly because she was starting to realize that Damien was as stubborn as she was. As she watched the girls play, she found herself thinking about how much her life had changed in just a few short months. She'd gone from barely surviving to living in a beautiful home with a man who was kind, patient, and generous beyond measure. And somewhere along the way, she'd stopped seeing him as just a stranger who'd offered to help her. She'd started seeing him as something more. It scared her. Tasha had been hurt before. She trusted the wrong people, believed the wrong promises, and paid the price for it. She'd sworn to herself that she'd never let anyone close enough to hurt her again. But Damien was different. He wasn't like the men from her past. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep. He didn't take without giving. He just was. And that was what made him so dangerous. "You okay?" Tasha jumped, startled out of her thoughts. She turned to find Damien standing beside her, drying his hands on a dish towel. He was wearing a green t-shirt and jeans, and his hair was slightly damp from the humidity. "Yeah," she said quickly. "Just thinking." "About what?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes curious. Tasha hesitated. She could tell him the truth, or she could brush it off and change the subject. But something in his gaze made her want to be honest. "About how different things are now," she said softly. "How much better they are." Damien smiled. "Good different." "Yeah," Tasha said. "Very good different." They stood there in comfortable silence, watching the girls play. Then Damien said, "I've been thinking too." "About what?" Tasha asked. "About how much I like having you here," he said. "You and Amara. This house has felt alive again. For the first time in years." Tasha's heart skipped a beat. She turned to look at him, and the sincerity in his expression made her breath catch. "Damien?" She started, but she didn't know what to say. "I'm not trying to make things weird," he said quickly. "I just wanted you to know that this arrangement, it's not just a favor anymore. At least not for me. You and Amara, you're part of this family now. And I don't want that to change." Tasha felt tears well up in her eyes. "I don't want it to change either." Damien reached out and gently brushed a tear from her cheek. His touch was warm and soft, and Tasha found herself leaning into it without thinking. "Can I tell you something?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Anything," Damien said. "I'm scared," Tasha admitted. "I'm scared that I'm starting to feel things for you. Real things. And I don't know if that's okay, or if I'm just confusing gratitude with something else." Damien's expression softened. "Tasha, you don't have to be scared. Whatever you're feeling, it's okay. And for what it's worth, I'm feeling it too." Tasha's eyes widened. "You are?" "Yeah," Damien said with a small, almost shy smile. "I am." They stood there, staring at each other, the air between them charged with something new and fragile. Then, slowly, Damien reached for her hand. Tasha didn't pull away. Instead, she laced her fingers through his, and they stood there together, holding hands like two people who were finally ready to take a chance on something real. Outside, the girls continued to play, oblivious to the shift that was happening inside the house. And as the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, Tasha allowed herself to hope for something she'd thought was impossible. A future filled with love, laughter, and the promise of something beautiful. That evening, after the girls had been bathed and put to bed, Tasha and Damien found themselves sitting together on the porch. The night was warm and clear, and the stars were scattered across the sky like diamonds on velvet. "Do you ever look up at the stars and feel small?" Tasha asked. "All the time," Damien said. "But not in a bad way. More like, it puts things in perspective, you know?" Tasha nodded. "Yeah. Like all the things we worry about, all the things that feel so big and overwhelming, they're just tiny moments in the grand scheme of things." "Exactly," Damien said. He turned to look at her. "You're pretty wise, you know that?" Tasha laughed. "I don't know about that. I've made a lot of mistakes." "We all have," Damien said. "But that doesn't make you any less wise. If anything, it makes you more so." Tasha smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "You're really good at saying the right thing, you know that?" "I try," Damien said with a grin. They sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, and then Damien said, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure," Tasha said. "If things were different, if we'd met under normal circumstances, do you think you'd have given me a chance?" Tasha thought about it. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I've been so focused on surviving for so long, I don't think I would have let myself see anyone. But now that I know you, yeah, I think I would have." Damien's smile widened. "Good to know." Tasha laughed, and then, on impulse, she leaned over and rested her head on his shoulder. Damien stiffened for just a moment, then he relaxed and wrapped his arm around her. They sat like that for a long time, watching the stars and listening to the crickets, and for the first time in a long time, Tasha felt at peace. Over the next few weeks, their relationship deepened. They spent more time together, talking late into the night, sharing stories, and learning about each other in ways that went beyond the surface. Tasha learned that Damien loved old movies and jazz music. He learned that Tasha had always dreamed of becoming a chef but had never had the chance to pursue it. One evening, as they were cleaning up after dinner, Damien said, "You know, if you wanted to go to culinary school, I could help with that." Tasha paused, a dish in her hand. "What? Culinary school?" Damien repeated. "You said it was your dream. Why not go for it?" Tasha shook her head. "I can't. I have Amara to think about and I don't have the money." "You have me," Damien said gently. "And we have a stable home. Amara is doing great. There's no reason you can't pursue your dream." Tasha stared at him, her heart pounding. "You'd really do that for me?" "Of course," Damien said. "I want you to be happy, Tasha. And if becoming a chef makes you happy, then I want to help you make that happen." Tears filled Tasha's eyes and she set down the dish, covering her face with her hands. Damien stepped closer and gently pulled her hands away. "Hey," he said softly. "Why are you crying?" "Because no one has ever believed in me like this," Tasha said, her voice breaking. "No one has ever told me that my dreams matter." Damien cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "They do matter. You matter. And I'm going to keep reminding you of that every single day if I have to." Tasha let out a shaky laugh and then, before she could second-guess herself, she leaned forward and kissed him. It was soft and tentative at first, just a gentle press of lips. But then Damien kissed her back, his hands moving to her waist, and suddenly the world fell away. There was just the two of them, standing in the kitchen, holding on to each other like they were afraid to let go. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathless. "Wow," Tasha whispered. "Yeah," Damien agreed. "Wow." They stood there, staring at each other, and then they both started laughing, the tension breaking in the most beautiful way. "So," Damien said, grinning, "does this mean you'll think about culinary school?" Tasha laughed and swatted his arm. "Yeah, I'll think about it." "Good," Damien said. He pulled her close and kissed her forehead. "Because you deserve all the good things, Tasha. And I'm going to make sure you get them." And as Tasha stood there in his arms, she knew that she'd finally found something she'd been searching for her whole life. She'd found home. The morning of the court review arrived faster than Tasha had anticipated. She'd been trying not to think about it, trying to focus on the good things happening in her life, but the anxiety had been building in the back of her mind like a storm cloud. Mrs. Delilah Grant had scheduled a final home visit before the court hearing, and Tasha had spent the entire previous day cleaning the house until it sparkled. Damien had told her she was being ridiculous, that the house was already spotless, but she couldn't help herself. She needed everything to be perfect. When Mrs. Grant arrived, she was greeted by a house filled with warmth and laughter. Nola and Amara were in the living room playing a board game and Damien was in the kitchen making tea. "Good morning, Mrs. Grant," Tasha said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Good morning," Mrs. Grant replied, her expression neutral as always. She stepped inside and looked around, taking in the cozy living room, the fresh flowers on the table, and the sound of the girls giggling in the background. "Please have a seat," Damien said, gesturing to the dining room table. "Can I get you some tea?" "That would be lovely, thank you," Mrs. Grant said. They all sat down and Mrs. Grant pulled out her clipboard. Tasha's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her heart pounding in her chest. "Miss Green, Mr. Foster," Mrs. Grant began, "as you know, this is the final home visit before the court hearing next week. I'll be observing the household dynamics and asking a few questions to ensure that Amara is in a safe and stable environment." "Of course," Damien said calmly. Mrs. Grant turned her attention to Tasha. "Miss Green, how have things been for you since Amara came home?" Tasha took a breath. "It's been amazing. Amara is doing so well. She's happy, she's healthy, and she's adjusting beautifully to her new school. I feel like I have my daughter back." "And how are you managing financially?" Mrs. Grant asked. "I'm doing well," Tasha said. "Damien has been incredibly supportive, and I've been able to focus on Amara without worrying about where our next meal is coming from." Mrs. Grant made a note on her clipboard, then turned to Damien. "Mr. Foster, how has this arrangement been for you and your daughter?" "It's been wonderful," Damien said. "Nola loves having Amara around. They've become best friends. And Tasha has brought a lot of joy and stability into our home." "And your relationship with Ms. Green?" Mrs. Grant asked, her eyes sharp. "How would you describe it?" Damien didn't hesitate. "We're partners. We support each other. We take care of each other's children. And we respect each other. It's a good relationship. Mrs. Grant studied him for a moment, then nodded. I see. She spent the next hour observing the household. She watched as Nola and Amara played together, their laughter filling the room. She asked Amara a few questions, and the little girl answered confidently, talking about how much she loved her new home and how happy she was to be with her mom again. Finally, Mrs. Grant stood and gathered her things. Thank you for your time, she said. I'll be submitting my report to the court before the hearing. Tasha's throat tightened. And what will the report say? Mrs. Grant looked at her, and for the first time, there was a hint of warmth in her eyes. It will say that Amara is thriving. That she's in a loving, stable home. And that you've done everything the court asked of you and more. Tasha felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. Mrs. Grant gave her a small smile, then turned to Damien. You're a good man, Mr. Foster. Not many people would do what you've done. I'm just doing what's right, Damien said. Mrs. Grant nodded, then left. The moment the door closed behind her, Tasha let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She sank into a chair, her hands shaking. Damien knelt beside her and took her hands in his. You did great, he said. I can't believe it's almost over, Tasha said, her voice trembling. I can't believe we're actually going to make it. We are, Damien said firmly. We're going to make it. The day of the court hearing was bright and clear. Tasha dressed carefully in a blue blouse and black slacks, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. Damien wore a gray suit, and they drove to the courthouse together in silence, their hands clasped tightly. When they arrived, they were directed to a small courtroom. Tasha's caseworker, Mrs. Grant, was already there, along with a lawyer representing the state. The judge, a stern-looking man with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, sat at the bench, reviewing a thick stack of papers. All rise, the bailiff said, and everyone stood. The judge looked up and gestured for them to sit. This is a hearing to review the custody status of Amara Green, he said. Ms. Green, you've been working to meet the requirements set forth by this court. Mrs. Grant, I've reviewed your report. Can you summarize your findings? Mrs. Grant stood. Your Honor, Ms. Green has met all the requirements. She has stable housing, a supportive partner, and a safe environment for her daughter. Amara is thriving in her care. I recommend that full custody be granted to Ms. Green with no further reviews. The judge nodded and looked at Tasha. Ms. Green, do you have anything you'd like to say? Tasha stood, her legs shaking. Yes, Your Honor. I just want to say that I love my daughter more than anything in the world. I've worked so hard to get her back, and I promise I will never let her down again. She's my whole life. The judge's expression softened slightly. I can see that, Ms. Green. And I commend you for your perseverance. He looked down at the papers in front of him, then back at Tasha. Based on the evidence presented and Mrs. Grant's recommendation, I am granting you full custody of Amara Green. There will be no further reviews. Tasha's knees buckled and Damien caught her, holding her steady. She couldn't speak, couldn't think, could only stand there as the judge's words washed over her. Thank you, she finally managed to choke out. Thank you so much. The judge smiled. You're welcome, Miss Green. Take good care of your daughter. They left the courtroom in a daze. Outside, in the bright sunlight, Tasha finally let herself break down. She sobbed openly, tears of relief and joy streaming down her face. Damien wrapped his arms around her, holding her close as she cried. We did it, he whispered. We did it. Yeah, Tasha said, laughing through her tears. We did. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. If you've ever felt powerless, if you've ever been told you weren't enough, drop a comment and tell me your story. And if this story has touched your heart, please subscribe. You won't want to miss the ending. Life after the court hearing felt surreal. Tasha kept expecting someone to knock on the door and tell her it had all been a mistake, that they were taking Amara away again. But days turned into weeks and no one came. Instead, life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Amara was enrolled in the local elementary school, where she quickly made friends and excelled in her classes. Nola and Amara continued to be inseparable, and Damien often joked that he now had 2 daughters instead of 1. Tasha, meanwhile, had taken Damien's advice and enrolled in a culinary program at a nearby community college. She attended classes 3 days a week, and on the days she wasn't in school, she practiced her cooking at home, experimenting with new recipes and techniques. One evening, she made a 3-course meal for Damien and the girls. She'd spent hours preparing it, and when she finally set the plates down on the table, she felt a flutter of nerves. This looks amazing, Damien said, his eyes wide. Try it first, Tasha said, biting her lip. Damien took a bite and his eyes closed in appreciation. Tasha, this is incredible. You're incredible. Tasha felt her cheeks flush with pride. You really think so? I know so, Damien said. He reached across the table and squeezed her hand. You're going to be an amazing chef. Amara and Nola chimed in with their own compliments, and Tasha felt a warmth spread through her chest. This was what happiness felt like. This was what home felt like. A few months later, Damien surprised Tasha with an envelope. They were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, when he handed it to her with a shy smile. What's this? Tasha asked. Open it, Damien said. Tasha opened the envelope and pulled out a piece of paper. Her breath caught when she saw what it was. It was a certificate of completion for her culinary program, along with a letter of acceptance to a prestigious culinary school in the city. Damien, she breathed. How did you? I called the school and asked about their scholarship program, Damien said. I told them about you, about your story, and they were impressed. They want to offer you a full scholarship. Tasha stared at the paper, tears streaming down her face. I can't believe this. Believe it, Damien said. You earned this, Tasha. You deserve this. Tasha looked up at him, her heart overflowing with love and gratitude. I don't know what I did to deserve you. You didn't have to do anything, Damien said. He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her gently. You just had to be you. That night, as Tasha lay in bed, she thought about how far she'd come. A year ago, she'd been on the verge of losing everything. And now, she had a home, a family, and a future that was brighter than she'd ever imagined. She thought about Damien, about the way he looked at her, the way he supported her, the way he made her feel like she was worth something. And she realized that somewhere along the way, she'd fallen in love with him. It wasn't the desperate, all-consuming love of fairy tales. It was something quieter, deeper, more real. It was the kind of love that was built on trust and respect and shared experiences. The kind of love that lasted. And as she drifted off to sleep, she allowed herself to hope for something she'd never thought possible. A happily ever after. 6 months later, Tasha stood in front of the mirror, smoothing down the front of her dress. It was a simple red dress, knee-length and elegant, and she'd paired it with a pair of low heels. Her hair was styled in soft waves, and she'd put on just enough makeup to feel confident without feeling overdone. Mama, you look beautiful, Amara said from the doorway. Tasha turned and smiled at her daughter. Amara was wearing a pale blue dress with tiny white flowers, and her curls were pulled back with a matching headband. She looked like a little princess. Thank you, baby, Tasha said, kneeling down to hug her. You look beautiful too. Is today the real wedding? Amara asked. Yes, Tasha said. Today Damien and I are going to renew our vows. What does that mean? Amara asked. It means we're saying our promises to each other again, Tasha explained. But this time it's because we want to, not because we have to. Amara smiled. I'm glad. I like Damien. And I like Nola. I like being a family. Tasha felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. Me too, baby. Me too. The ceremony was held in the backyard of the house. It was small and intimate, with just a handful of close friends and neighbors in attendance. Lou from the diner was there, along with Brianna and a few other co-workers. Mrs. Delilah Grant had even come, much to Tasha's surprise and delight. The backyard had been decorated with strings of white lights and fresh flowers. There was a small archway covered in roses, and a short aisle lined with chairs for the guests. When it was time, Tasha walked down the aisle, her arm linked with Amara's. Nola walked beside them, carrying a small basket of flower petals. At the end of the aisle, Damien stood waiting, dressed in a sharp blue suit that made his eyes shine. When Tasha reached him, he took her hands in his and smiled. You look stunning, he said softly. So do you, Tasha replied. The officiant, a kind older man with a warm smile, began the ceremony. He spoke about love and commitment, about the journey that Tasha and Damien had taken together, and about the family they had built. Then it was time for the vows. Damien went first. Tasha, he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. When I met you, I didn't know what I was getting into. I just knew that you needed help and I wanted to be the one to give it. But somewhere along the way you stopped being someone I was helping, and you became someone I couldn't imagine my life without. You've brought light and laughter and love back into my life, and I'm so grateful for every moment we've shared. I promise to stand by you, to support you, to love you for as long as I live. Tasha was crying now, tears streaming down her face. She took a breath and began her own vows. Damien, she said, her voice shaking. You saved me. Not just from losing my daughter, but from losing myself. You showed me that kindness still exists, that good people still exist, and that I'm worthy of love. You've given me a home, a family, and a future that I never thought I'd have. I promise to love you with everything I have, to be your partner, your friend, and your biggest supporter for the rest of my life." Damien squeezed her hands, his own eyes glistening with tears. The officiant smiled. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Again, you may kiss your bride." Damien pulled Tasha close and kissed her, and this time, it was full of love and promise and all the things they'd built together. The small crowd erupted in applause, and Nola and Amara cheered loudly, clapping their hands together. When they pulled apart, they were both laughing, and Tasha felt like her heart might burst from happiness. The reception was simple but beautiful. There was food, music, and laughter. Tasha watched as Amara and Nola danced together, their giggles filling the air. She watched as Damien talked with Lou, the two of them laughing about something. And she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for everything she had. Later in the evening, as the sun began to set and the lights in the backyard twinkled like stars, Damien pulled Tasha onto the makeshift dance floor. "Dance with me?" he asked. "Always," Tasha said. They swayed together to the music, their arms wrapped around each other. Tasha rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Are you happy?" Damien asked softly. "More than I ever thought possible," Tasha said. She looked up at him. "Are you?" "Yeah," Damien said, smiling down at her. "I really am." A few weeks later, Tasha stood in the kitchen of her new culinary school, wearing a chef's coat with her name embroidered on the front. She was chopping vegetables for a class assignment, her movements confident and precise. Damien had driven her to the school that morning, and as he'd walked her to the door, he kissed her and told her he was proud of her. And for the first time in her life, Tasha believed him. She'd come so far. From a desperate waitress on the verge of losing everything, to a woman with a family, a home, and a dream within reach. And she knew that none of it would have been possible without Damien's kindness, without his willingness to step in and help when no one else would. But more than that, she knew that she'd done this. She'd fought for her daughter. She'd fought for herself. And she'd won. That evening, as the four of them sat around the dinner table, Tasha looked at the faces of the people she loved. Amara with her bright smile and infectious laugh. Nola with her curiosity and boundless energy. And Damien with his steady presence and unwavering support. "Thank you," Tasha said suddenly, her voice thick with emotion. Damien looked up. "For what?" "For everything," Tasha said. "For believing in me. For giving me a chance. For making me feel like I'm worth something." Damien reached across the table and took her hand. "You've always been worth something, Tasha. I just helped you see it." Amara and Nola exchanged a look, then they both got up and ran over to Tasha and Damien, throwing their arms around them. "Group hug," Nola shouted. They all laughed, and Tasha felt tears of joy streaming down her face. This was her family. This was her home. And she was never letting it go. Months turned into years. Tasha graduated from culinary school at the top of her class and opened her own catering business. Damien continued to run his tech company, but he made sure to always be home for dinner. Nola and Amara grew up together, becoming more like sisters than friends. And through it all, Tasha and Damien's love only grew stronger. They faced challenges as all families do, but they faced them together. They supported each other, lifted each other up, and reminded each other every day that they were in this for the long haul. One evening, years after that first desperate prayer in the diner break room, Tasha found herself back on the porch, watching the sunset. Damien sat beside her, their hands intertwined. "You know," Tasha said, "I used to think that love was something that happened in movies. Something that wasn't real. And now?" Damien asked. "Now I know that love is real," Tasha said. "It's just not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's just showing up, day after day, and choosing each other." Damien smiled and kissed her temple. "I choose you, Tasha. Every single day." "I choose you too," Tasha said. And as they sat there together, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Tasha knew that she'd finally found what she'd been searching for her whole life. She'd found home. She'd found love. And she'd found hope. And this time it was forever.